What would you do if the man appointed to protect you was the same man your mother had once tried to destroy? What if he was cold and beautiful and furious, and you were completely alone in his house with no one else left in the world? Chapter 1. The Ward. The letter arrived on the same morning they buried her mother. Cecily Ashworth stood at the graveside in the thin October rain, her black veil plastered against her cheeks, and thought, "I am 19 years old, and I have no one left in the world." She did not cry. She had spent 3 weeks crying in the dark of her mother's sick room, while Vivian Ashworth, beautiful, reckless, scandal-gilded. Vivian coughed herself toward the grave with an efficiency that had surprised even the doctors. There were no tears left. There was only the grey sky, the wet earth, and Mr. Holt, her mother's solicitor, hovering at her elbow with the expression of a man who had been dreading this particular conversation for quite some time. "Miss Ashworth," he said, when the last of the mourners, a thin collection. Vivian had outlived most of her friends, and alienated the rest had drifted away through the cemetery gates. "There is a matter of some urgency." "There always is," Cecily said, "when one's mother has died, leaving nothing but debts and a reputation." Mr. Holt had the grace to look uncomfortable. He produced the letter from his coat. The seal on it was black wax, stamped with a crest she didn't recognize an eagle with its wings spread, and beneath it, a single word in Latin she couldn't quite read in the rain. "Your mother made provisions," he said carefully, "some years ago. In the event of her death before your marriage or your 21st birthday, she appointed a guardian for you." Cecily looked at the letter. "Who?" The pause that followed was the kind that contained a great deal of history. "His Grace, the Duke of Ashmore." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Even Cecily, who had spent her childhood largely insulated from the worst of her mother's reputation, knew that name. Every drawing-room in England knew that name in connection with Vivian Ashworth. The whispers had followed her mother like cheap perfume she tried to trap him. Claimed he'd compromised her, but he was too powerful, too clever. He escaped the net, and now here he was, reaching out from the past to claim the daughter. "He agreed to this?" Cecily asked. "He was informed of the arrangement last week," Mr. Holt said, which was not, she noted, an answer to the question she had actually asked. She looked down at the seal, at the eagle with its wings spread. She thought about her mother, about Vivian in her last weeks, when the illness had stripped away everything performative and left only what was real underneath, and how there had been moments, brief and unguarded, when she had said his name. Not often, never explaining, just names sometimes in the dark, as though it were an old debt she was settling with herself. Whatever she did, Cecily thought, folding the letter, I am not her, and I will not apologize for her. She got into the carriage. She went north. Ashmore Park was 3 hours north of London, and every mile of it felt like a sentence being handed down. The landscape hardened from soft southern fields into something older and more severe as the afternoon wore on. Hills grew steeper. Trees along the road thinned into skeletal shapes against a pewter sky. By the time the carriage turned through the iron gates of the estate, the light had the particular quality of late autumn afternoon, golden and cold and slightly melancholy, like something beautiful in the process of dying. The house was extraordinary. She had expected grandeur, he was a duke after all, but she had not expected this. A vast baroque pile of pale limestone that seemed to have grown from the hillside rather than been built upon it, its windows catching the last of the sunlight like a row of watchful amber eyes. Formal gardens stretched from the south facade in geometric precision, the boxwood hedges trimmed to knife edges, every line and angle observed with a rigour that struck her as less decorative than compulsive. Everything about Ashmore Park spoke of control, of order enforced at some personal cost. A butler admitted her with the smooth efficiency of a man who had been instructed to be polite at all costs, which was not quite the same thing as being warm. She was shown to a sitting room. The fire was lit. Tea was brought. A clock on the mantelpiece marked the minutes. She was standing at the window studying those relentless formal gardens when the door opened behind her. She turned. She knew immediately it was him. He was not what she had imagined. She had constructed, in the miserable hours of the carriage journey, a figure assembled from her mother's avoidances and society's cold gossip. Middle-aged, perhaps, thick-necked and florid, the kind of man who wielded power like a blunt instrument. She was wrong in almost every particular. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, with the kind of lean, broad-shouldered build that spoke of a life spent outdoors rather than in drawing-rooms. His hair was very dark, almost black, and worn without fashionable artifice, as though he had run a hand through it and considered the matter resolved. His face stopped her, which she resented. She had intended to observe him with clinical detachment, and his face made that immediately difficult. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, a nose that had been broken once and set slightly imperfectly, which somehow only improved the composition. A mouth that was, in its current set, ungenerous but shaped, she noticed, despite herself, for something other than severity when it chose to be. He might have been carved from the same limestone as his house. He looked exactly like a man who had once been very handsome and had then decided to stop bothering about it. He was 32. She knew this from Mr. Holt's nervous disclosure in the carriage. He looked both younger and older than 32, depending on which aspect of him you were examining. His eyes, when they found her across the room, were grey, a pale, almost silver grey, and they assessed her with an expression that was not quite hostile and not quite cold, but was thoroughly, carefully neutral in a way she found more unsettling than either. "Miss Ashworth," he said. His voice was low and extremely controlled. "Your Grace." She stood, because courtesy demanded it, and lifted her chin, because self-preservation demanded that. "I imagine this situation is as disagreeable to you as it is to me. I thought we might as well acknowledge that immediately, and spare each other the pretense." Something moved in his expression. It was gone too quickly to identify. "Sit down, Miss Ashworth." She sat, because there was nowhere else to go, and because she was tired from the journey and the burial and the accumulated weight of the last 3 weeks, and because some battles were not worth choosing on the first evening. He remained standing. That, she suspected, was deliberate, and moved to the window she had just vacated, looking out at his perfect garden with his hands clasped behind his back. She had the impression of a man who used windows the way other men used distance, as a way of being present without quite committing to it. "I will be direct with you," he said at last. "I did not agree to this guardianship. I was informed of it, as you may already know. Your mother made the arrangement some years ago without consulting me. I have spent the last 2 weeks attempting to find a legal mechanism by which to transfer the responsibility to another party." He paused. "I have been unable to do so." The precision of it was almost impressive. "How reassuring," Cecily said. He turned from the window, and she saw something in his face, not quite anger, more contained than anger, the expression of a man who has spent considerable time in the company of a feeling he has refused to name. "I will not pretend, as you say, that I welcome this arrangement." Another pause. "But I will not be unkind to you. You are not your mother." It was the most ambiguous thing anyone had said to her in recent memory, and it landed somewhere tender. She kept her face very still. "No," she said quietly, "I am not." The silence between them was not comfortable. But it was, she noticed, and this surprised her, at least honest. "You will have the east wing," he said. "A lady's maid will be assigned to you. You are free to use the library, the gardens, and the music room. I would ask that you not receive callers without informing me first, for reasons that will be apparent to you." He moved to the door. "I keep largely to myself. I do not expect you to disrupt that arrangement." "You want me to be invisible?" He paused with his hand on the door. "I want us both," he said, with a precision that felt like a blade drawn slowly across skin. "To be comfortable." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the sun had finished setting, and the garden had dissolved into blue shadow, all those perfect edges gone soft in the dusk. "Then we may have a problem, Your Grace," Cecily said, "because I have never in my life been particularly good at being invisible." He looked at her one last look, long and unreadable, and left without another word. She found the portrait on her 4th day. She had been exploring the house as she always did in new spaces, following corridors to their conclusions, pushing open doors that had not been pushed for some time, given the small resistance of their hinges. The house was vast and largely unused, whole wings draped in holland covers, furniture standing under white shrouds, like a household of ghosts frozen mid-arrangement. A billiards room, undisturbed for years, a ballroom with a ceiling painting of mythological figures, dimmed with age but still magnificent, a conservatory in which someone had long ago planted jasmine that had since taken the entire structure in a fragrant, extravagant possession, flowering out of season in the warmth of the glass. The portrait was in a small anteroom off the east corridor, hung without ceremony between 2 doors, as though it had been relocated from somewhere grander and not yet found its proper home, or as though it had been put somewhere unlikely to be visited. It was a woman, a young woman, perhaps 25, in the fashion of 15 years ago, with blonde hair piled elegantly and a gown of deep rose silk. She was seated in a chair in a garden. Cecily recognised the formal garden of Ashmore Park behind her, the hedges smaller and less established, and she was laughing at something outside the frame, turned slightly away, caught in the unguarded space between poses. She was beautiful, radiantly and carelessly beautiful, in the way that some people are when they have stopped thinking about it, and she was unmistakably, with a lurch of cold recognition, Cecily's mother. Vivienne Ashworth, perhaps 25 years old, laughing in his gardens, sitting in his chair as though she belonged there, as though this had, at some point, been hers. Cecily stood before the portrait for a long time, working through the arithmetic of it. The painting was 15, perhaps 16 years old. Her mother had been placed here in his garden, painted with an ease and familiarity that spoke of far more than a single visit when Cecily herself had been 3 or 4 years old. She had always been told the scandal was a single incident, a misunderstanding, badly handled. One accusation, swiftly denied. The portrait said something considerably more complicated. That was not meant to be found. His voice came from the doorway behind her. She turned. He was in riding clothes still, mud at his boots. His cravat loosened. He had not expected to encounter her here, which was perhaps why, for a fraction of a second before composure reassembled itself, she caught a glimpse of what his face looked like underneath the careful severity. Older than 32. Tired, in the specific way of people who have been carrying something for a long time. "Who moved it?" she asked. "I had it taken from the gallery 3 years ago." "Why?" A pause. "Because I found looking at it uncomfortable." She turned back to the portrait, her mother's face young and open and laughing, her mother in his garden. "She looks happy," Cecily said, and was surprised by how much it cost her. It was a strange thing, to see the person you had lost as someone other than who you had known, to find them young and unguarded in a place you had never imagined them. "She was," said the Duke of Ashmore from the doorway, and then seemed to hear what he had said, and was silent. Chapter 2. The Portrait and the Past. He did not avoid her after that. Cecily had half expected him to, had braced herself for a new layer of frost, the distances in the house redoubling. But something had shifted in that grey anteroom, some equilibrium disturbed, and it did not settle back into its previous arrangement. She began to encounter him in the library in the evenings. He did not speak at first. They occupied the two ends of a very long room, in a silence that was, incrementally and almost imperceptibly, changing character, less like hostility, more like something she might almost call companionship, if she were feeling generous. She broke it on the 5th evening. "The jasmine in the conservatory," she said, without looking up from her book. "Someone planted it deliberately. It's not the kind of thing that colonizes a space by accident." A pause, the quiet rustle of papers. "Yes," he said. "Who?" A longer pause. "Your mother." Cecily lowered her book. He was looking at his ledgers, or appearing to. His eyes had that quality of focus directed inward rather than at the page in front of him. The firelight moved across the angles of his face and softened the severity of it, and she caught a glimpse of something she had been trying to locate since she arrived the person underneath the architecture. She had strong opinions about plants, he said, and she understood from the careful, measured quality of the words that each one was being tested before release. She thought the conservatory was wasted on palms. A pause. "She said that anything worth growing should change the air when you walk through the door." Cecily felt something happen in her chest grief, of a peculiar variety, the kind that comes not from loss itself, but from discovering that the person you lost was larger and more real than the version you were given. "She never told me," Cecily said, "that she knew you. Not really. Not like this." "No." He set down his pen. "I would not have expected her to. What happened between you?" The directness of it surprised even her. She had been circling this question since she arrived, and now here it was in the open air between them. "Not the version society tells, the actual truth of it." He was very still. "That is not a simple question. I'm not asking for a simple answer." He looked at her, then a full, direct look, not the careful peripheral assessments she had grown used to. She held it without flinching. She had her mother's colouring, the dark blonde hair, the warm complexion, but not her mother's particular brand of beauty, which had been soft and immediately disarming. Cecily was finer-boned, darker around the eyes, with a stillness that people sometimes mistook for coldness, until they understood it was something else entirely, a kind of concentrated attention, the quality of someone who watches the world very carefully and draws her own conclusions. She did not trade on her appearance. She had seen too precisely what trading on beauty had cost her mother. He looked at her as though making a decision. "Come to the study tomorrow morning," he said, "after breakfast. There are things you should read." The study smelled of old paper and leather and faintly, horses his particular smell, she was coming to recognize, underneath the cool formality of the rooms. He was at the desk when she arrived, a wooden correspondence box open before him. He did not offer pleasantries. "These are letters," he said, "between your mother and myself, from years ago. I would ask you to read them here, in this room, and to know that I show them to you in good faith. Not to defend myself, not to speak ill of her, but because you asked for the truth, and you have every right to it." Cecily sat. She picked up the first letter. She had known her mother was clever. It had been one of the great frustrations of Vivian Ashworth's life that the world had never quite known what to do with an intelligent, beautiful woman without sufficient fortune to make her intelligence respectable. But these letters were something beyond clever. They were brilliant, sharp and funny and achingly self-aware, full of observations about society and human behaviour that made Cecily want to laugh and grieve simultaneously. And threaded through all of it, visible as a current beneath moving water, was the evolution of something real. Something genuine between her mother and a man who had apparently been, in his mid-20s, very different from the composed and distant figure who now stood by the window watching her read. His replies were in the box too. Smaller, more careful handwriting than she had expected, but warmer in register than his spoken voice by a significant distance. He had found her funny. He had argued with her about books and philosophy and politics, and been delighted when she argued back. He had written in one letter that made Cecily's hands go very still on the page. "I find I am looking for you in every room before I remember you are not there, which is an irrational and thoroughly inconvenient discovery to have made about another person. I report it to you only because I believe you will find it as inconvenient as I do, and I think you deserve fair warning." Below it, in her mother's handwriting, a single line she had apparently scrawled directly onto his letter, rather than responding in a separate one. "I have known for weeks. I chose not to warn you. I am not sorry." Cecily looked up. "You were in love with her." He was standing by the window, always that view. "Yes." "Then why—" She looked at the date on the last letter. Then nothing. A cliff edge. "Why did it stop?" "Read the final 3 letters," he said quietly. "They are not from your mother." The final 3 letters were from a man named Sir Edmund Ashworth, no relation to Cecily's family by blood. Vivian had taken the name from a brief first marriage to a young man who had died of a riding accident 8 months after the wedding. Sir Edmund was, from context, a distant cousin of that dead husband, and had apparently retained some proprietary feeling about the name Vivian continued to use. His letters were not correspondence. They were demands. Cecily read them twice, set them down, read them a third time to be certain she had understood correctly. "He was blackmailing you," she said. "He had information about my father." His voice from the window was entirely flat, the voice of someone recounting a thing they have revisited so many times it has been worn smooth of all outward feeling. "A financial matter. A serious one, the kind that would have been ruinous to the family name and to several people who depended on that name. Sir Edmund offered to bury the information. In exchange for what? A beat. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Marriage to your mother." Cecily heard the full architecture of it, then understood it in one cold, clear apprehension, the way you understand a fall only when you have already left the edge. "And you thought she was part of it," she said. "I thought—" He stopped, began again. "I thought the preceding 2 years had been a construction, an arrangement between them, engineered from the beginning. A pause that had the weight of many years in it. I was wrong." The words fell into the silence of the study and lay there. "She didn't know," Cecily said. "Not quite a question. She found out what Sir Edmund had done approximately 3 months after I ended all contact. She wrote to me." He moved to the desk slowly, like a man approaching something he is still not entirely at ease with, and lifted a single folded paper from beneath the wooden box, kept separately from the others, set apart deliberately. "I did not read it at the time." Cecily took the letter. The handwriting was not the bright, rapid script of the earlier correspondence. It was careful, restrained, the handwriting of someone composing themselves with considerable effort before setting pen to paper. "I know what he did. I know what you must believe of me, and I understand why. I cannot ask you to believe otherwise. I have no proof to offer, and no means of compelling your trust. I ask only one thing, that you know I was not part of it. Whatever the world now says of me, whatever becomes of my name and my life from this day, I was not part of it. I loved you honestly. That is all I have left to give you, and I give it knowing you may never read these words. I am sorry that it was not enough. Cecily folded the letter precisely along its existing creases. She was very quiet. She let me believe the society version, she finally said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. She let me grow up thinking she had done something calculating and shameful. She never corrected it. She paused. Not once, but even at the end. Perhaps, he said carefully, it was easier than the alternative. What was the alternative? He met her eyes, admitting that she had genuinely loved a man who hadn't trusted her enough to read her last letter. The words were quiet and precise, and contained within them, she understood with absolute clarity, years of self-reproach. He was not asking for absolution. He was simply stating a fact about himself, with the particular honesty of someone who has stopped trying to mitigate it. The study was very still. Outside, a wind worked its way through the trees, a low, sustained sound, almost like breathing, almost like the house exhaling. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "You kept it for all this time." "Because you are very like her," he said, and the words came slowly, as though each one had to be cleared before it could be spoken. "Not in the ways people will warn you about, not in the ways that will cause you harm, in the ways that mattered." He paused. "And because I would like someone, before too much more time has passed, to know the truth of who she was. Someone who loved her. Someone who deserves to." Cecily looked at him across the desk, across the open box of letters, across the space of years, across a mistake that had cost her mother everything, and had clearly cost him something too, something she was only beginning to understand the dimensions of. The firelight shifted across his face. He was, she thought, with a clarity that arrived entirely without her permission, extraordinarily, unfairly beautiful in his severity, like a cathedral, like something built for endurance rather than comfort, that had achieved a kind of grandeur in the attempt. She was 19 years old. She was entirely alone in his house, and she understood in that moment, with an acuity that alarmed her, that she was in very considerable danger. Not from him, from herself. The days that followed changed texture. Not dramatically, he was not a man of dramatic gestures, and she was not a woman who trusted them, but in the way that light changes in a room when a window is opened. Something was admitted that had not been there before. She found him in the conservatory one afternoon, not working, simply standing among her mother's jasmine, with a quality of stillness that looked less like composure than like grief. And she did not intrude, but stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, and felt her chest tighten with something she had no name for yet, but which was already, she suspected, going to be a problem. He began to speak to her at dinner. Cautiously at first about the estate, the tenants, the management of the land, and then gradually about other things. She had read widely and thought carefully, and had no interest in performing less intelligence than she possessed, and he met that directly, without the faint condescension she had encountered in other educated men who were surprised to find a woman capable of disagreement. He argued with her. She argued back. He listened when she was right, and said so without ceremony, which was, she was discovering, one of the more genuinely attractive qualities a person could possess. One evening, she played the pianoforte in the music room, and he came to stand in the doorway and listen without announcing himself, and she knew he was there for the last 10 minutes of the sonata and played through it without acknowledging him, and when she finally turned, he was looking at her with an expression that had nothing careful about it at all, and for one suspended, complicated moment, neither of them said anything. "Your mother played," he said at last. "I know," said Cecily. "She taught me." He nodded once, as though that answered a question he hadn't asked aloud, and left. But she sat at the pianoforte for a long time after, her hands in her lap, her heart conducting itself with a complete disregard for her better judgment. Chapter 3. What Reviving a Scandal Costs. The first snow came in November, and with it a letter from London. Cecily was in the conservatory tending her mother's jasmine, which she had taken to doing each morning with a combination of grief and deliberate purpose, as though the act of keeping it alive were a form of conversation with someone no longer available when the Duke appeared in the doorway. He had the letter in his hand. His expression was the careful, controlled blankness she had learned to read as the surface layer of something considerably more turbulent underneath. "There is talk in London," he said. "Of course there is." She set down her gardening cloth. "There was always going to be." "The nature of the talk is predictable." She knew what he meant. She had known since the day she arrived that this was coming, had felt it accumulating at a distance, the way you feel a storm before it breaks. The daughter of Vivian Ashworth, living in the house of the man her mother had allegedly tried to trap. Society would not be able to resist the narrative. Society never could. "Who wrote to you?" "Lady Harkastle." He moved fully into the conservatory, and the space warm from the glass, fragrant from the jasmine, much smaller than the formal rooms they usually occupied, made his presence register differently than it did in the library or the study. He was very tall. She was already aware of this, had always been aware of it, but in this particular space it was simply more present. "She recommends you be removed to a suitable establishment before Christmas, a companion arranged, a respectable distance observed, for both our sakes." Cecily was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you want?" He did not answer immediately. That, she knew now, was never neutral. "What I want," he said, "is not the operative consideration." "I disagree. I think it is precisely the operative consideration." She turned to face him fully. "Unless you mean to tell me you do all of this, without reference to what you actually want, purely as a matter of abstract duty. In which case I would say your father's financial scandal has a great deal to answer for." Something shifted in his expression. A complicated thing, almost something that wanted to be amusement, complicated by awareness. "You are extremely direct," he said. "My mother spent her whole life performing softness she didn't feel because the world demanded it," Cecily said evenly. "I decided early on that I wouldn't." She paused. She might have been happier if she'd done the same. He was silent for a moment. Then, "Possibly. She hid a great deal, your mother. I did not always understand that." He said it with the careful honesty of someone acknowledging a failure of perception rather than simply stating a fact. She looked at him. He was close enough now that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his silver-grey eyes evidence, she thought, not so much of age as of a face that had spent a long time held in tension. Up close, the severity was different than it appeared across a room. Not absent, it was structural. It was genuinely part of him, but layered, and underneath it, visible to someone paying close attention, something that was neither cold nor controlled. A warmth held under significant pressure, like banked coals, like light behind glass. She had been paying very close attention for weeks. She was aware that this was unwise. She was finding it increasingly difficult to care. "The scandal," she said. "If you were to disregard Lady Harkastle's advice, if we were to—" She stopped, assembled herself. "It would be worse than what your mother faced. A great deal worse." "Yes," he said, "I have considered that. Society would say you had done what they always suspected you did, that the only difference between you and Sir Edmund is that you succeeded where he failed, that you finished what he started. Yes," his voice was steady, "I have considered that as well." "And?" He was quiet for a long moment. The snow was falling harder beyond the glass now, covering the formal garden in white, the geometric perfection of it slowly dissolving under an impartial and unhurried accumulation. All those knife-edge lines, all that enforced order, going soft. "I spent years," he said at last, "constructing a life designed to avoid this." He was not looking at the garden. He was looking at her, with the directness that was, she had come to understand, his truest register. The house, the solitude, the reputation for reclusiveness, which I did not discourage because it was useful. All of it arranged to ensure that nothing could reach me, nothing that mattered ever again. A pause. "I believed this was wisdom. I have recently come to believe it was cowardice dressed in respectable clothes." The conservatory was very quiet. Somewhere in the house a clock was marking the hour, muffled by walls and distance. "My mother's last letter," Cecily said softly. "She wrote, 'I loved you honestly.' She didn't ask for a future. She didn't ask you to fix it. She just wanted to be believed." "I know." His voice had changed the control thinner now, something raw underneath. "I know, and I cannot—" He stopped. "There is no way to undo it." "No." She looked at him steadily. "But you could choose not to make the same mistake again." He looked at her for a long time. She watched him watch the working of something in his expression, something being weighed and found heavier than expected, and lifted anyway. "Cecily," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it go through her like a note struck on a resonant string felt it and did not look away. "There are things I want to say to you," he said carefully, "that I am not certain I have the right to say." "Then I will make it easier." She held his gaze. "I am not my mother. I am not a trap, or a scheme, or an echo of something you lost. I am myself. I have been in this house for 6 weeks, and I have watched you very carefully, and I believe you are a man who made one terrible mistake out of pain and pride, and has been paying for it in solitude for over a decade. And I think—" She paused. "I think that is long enough." Something broke quietly in his expression. Not dramatically, there was nothing dramatic about this man. She was sure of that now, and she was glad of it, but in the way that a lock gives when the right key is finally tried. Something that had been held closed, opening, carefully, on the possibility of what was on the other side. He raised his hand, slowly, with the deliberateness he brought to everything. He touched her face, the backs of his fingers against her cheek, barely a touch, restrained almost to the edge of its own existence, and she let out a breath she had not quite realized she was holding. "I have been trying," he said very quietly, "not to do this." "I know. You have been trying very hard." She turned her cheek slightly into his hand, just a fraction. "You have been trying since approximately the 3rd day." A breath of something that was not quite a laugh. "The 2nd, he said. "The portrait." "The portrait," she agreed softly. His thumb moved against her cheekbone, one slow, deliberate stroke, and the air in the conservatory was suddenly made of jasmine and November, and the particular awareness of being looked at by someone who is seeing you rather than seeing what they expected to find. His eyes were very light, very serious, very near. "The world will not be kind about this," he said. "The world has never been kind about my family." She met his gaze. "I am not afraid of it." "You should be, at least a little." But his hand had not moved. "Perhaps." She held very still, not from uncertainty, but from the opposite, from the fullness of the moment, from not wanting it to happen a second before it was ready to. "Are you afraid?" He considered this with genuine seriousness. "I am afraid," he said at last, "of doing this badly, of not deserving it, of—" he paused, "of you realizing at some point that I am a great deal more limited in my capacity for ease and lightness than you deserve." She studied him, the strong jaw, the careful eyes, the mouth that was, in this unguarded configuration, everything she had suspected it was capable of being. "Sebastian," she said. She had found his given name in one of the letters used only once by her mother in a moment of evident exasperation. "Sebastian, you are being willfully obtuse, and you know it perfectly well." She had been saving it, she realized, for exactly this moment. He went absolutely still at the sound of it. "I am 19 years old, and I have buried my mother, and I have been alone in the world for 6 weeks," she said quietly. "I do not need ease and lightness. I need someone who means what they say and says what they mean and will not flinch." She paused. "Can you do that?" He looked at her for one long, unguarded moment, in which everything he was everything held in careful abeyance behind those pale eyes, and that composed severity was simply present, without management or mitigation. "Yes," he said, low and certain, the voice of a man making a promise rather than a declaration. "I can do that." She rose on her toes and kissed him. Not tentatively, she was not, and had never been, a tentative person, whatever else she was uncertain of. She kissed him with the honesty of someone who has already decided, and he made a sound low in his chest and kissed her back with a fervour that had clearly been under very considerable pressure for quite some time, one hand cradling her jaw and the other finding the small of her back, and the jasmine outrageous around them, flowering in November, filling the glass-enclosed air with the scent of something that had no business being alive in this season, and was alive anyway. He pulled back first gently, not in retreat, but in something like care. His forehead came down to rest against hers. His breathing was not entirely steady. She was glad of that. "The scandal," he said against her hairline. "Will be significant," she agreed. "The gossip. Enormous. My solicitor will be. Appalled, presumably. Lady Harcastle. Will write you a very long letter." She drew back enough to look at him. His face, close and unguarded and faintly undone, was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a long time, and she did not look away from it. "Are you listing all of this for my benefit or your own?" "My own, I think." A pause. His thumb moved in a slow arc against her cheek. "I want to be certain I have thought it through." "And have you?" "I have been thinking it through," he said, with a dry, honest precision that she was going to be helpless against for the rest of her life, and she already knew it. Since approximately the 3rd day. "The 2nd, she corrected. "The portrait." He almost smiled. It transformed his face entirely, and she filed it away, the rarity of it making it more valuable, not less. She thought of her mother's laugh in the painting, captured against this same garden. She thought of a letter. "I loved you honestly. I'm sorry it was not enough." It had not been enough. But it had planted jasmine in his conservatory, and it had made him keep a portrait in a room he had put somewhere unlikely to be found, and it had arranged across many years and one terrible mistake and the slow wreckage of a life, for the daughter to arrive at the end of an October rain and find her way through the anteroom and the correspondence box, and the grief and the distance to this moment. This extraordinary and improbable November, this greenhouse full of her mother's flowers, this man who had finally, at considerable personal cost, chosen to stop retreating. She would have found this completely unbearable, Cecily said softly. He made a sound low and warm and almost a laugh. She would have been insufferable about it indefinitely. "Years," Cecily agreed. "And she would have been right," he said quietly. "And she would have known she was right, and she would have told me so at every available opportunity." Cecily laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her, and she felt him react to it as though to something unexpected and wanted, his hand tightening slightly at the small of her back. Outside, the snow was falling steadily and quietly, covering everything in white. The formal garden dissolved under it, the geometric precision, the enforced edges, all the careful maintenance of distance and order, going soft and formless under an accumulation that did not negotiate. The jasmine flowered extravagantly against all seasonal reason, the air thick with it, the glass warm around them while the world outside turned cold and quiet and new. There were letters to write, and solicitors to face, and a world full of opinions to survive. There was a scandal to weather, and a name, 2 names, both of them complicated, to either rehabilitate or simply outlast. There was the long, slow work of 2 people who had learned, by different routes and at considerable cost, that the world was not safe, and that this was not, in the end, a reason to stop reaching for the things that mattered. All of that was waiting, patient and real, on the other side of the conservatory glass. But here now, his hand warm at her back and her mother's jasmine filling the air, and the snow remaking the world outside into something clean, something unheld by the past here, in the fragrant, improbable warmth of a November that had no right to be blooming and was blooming anyway, was a beginning. And beginnings, Cecily thought, holding the gaze of a man who was finally, visibly, gladly, choosing not to look away, beginnings were enough. They were, in fact, everything. If you enjoyed this journey into the secrets of Ashmore Park, please hit that like button and let me know your favourite moment in the comments below. Does Cecily remind you of her mother, or is she truly her own woman? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this unfolding story. Thanks for watching.